My great pleasure to welcome Jean-Pierre Chaucheux. I'm glad he accepted the invitation to come. And I saw several of his talks and I was already very impressed. I already introduced him yesterday in the round table, and he will talk about electrical phenomena associated. No, that's not. Okay, yeah, then I need the booklet. You're trying to trick me. A hierarchical multi-level model of brain communications from the dynamics of allosteric transitions to conscious processing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be with you and share viewpoints. Even I'm not a physicist, I am a marine biologist. And in fact, I started to work on animal species and as a student, and then shift to molecular biology, then to neurobiology, and perhaps back to physics, thanks to Conrad. But this is just to establish a link with the presentation which was given this morning. And since it was emphasized that acetylcholine could generate proton and then have an effect of membranes, and I want to realize that the person who talked about this was perhaps not born at that time. And this was in, if you can see that, in 57. Okay, so it's a little bit like a joke to introduce my presentation, but in fact they are data, and when I showed this data, which had the front cover of Science, you cannot imagine that, then one of my good friends said, so what do you want to show with this phenomenon? I said, I don't know, it's an electrical phenomenon, but that's not exactly what us as physiologists want to show. We are concerned by the effect of neurotransmitter on membrane, and I don't think this has anything to do with the effect of neurotransmitter on membrane, and therefore I just abandoned this idea, and I'm pleased that there is a resurrection. We are close to Easter, and this morning there was some kind of resurrection of this phenomenon, which, of course, I am not going to discuss today. It's just a little bit of a joke for the introduction of my presentation. In fact, I have, as I said, been concerned by the mechanism of synaptic transmission and the effect of neurotransmitter on receptors, and this is an important issue that I don't think I will discuss today. The simple framework of the synapse, or of the molecular biology of the synapse, but in a much more general framework, because I'm convinced that those days we should neither be molecular biologists, neither physicists, neither neurobiologists, but have integrated view of science. And just to illustrate this point, that all of us should be multidisciplinary and say, this is the physicist approach, this is the molecular biology approach. For me, this is just nonsense. And the sense has to be found here, in the sense that all what we are to understand in the human brain, which in fact is our goal, all of us, to try to understand how we think, how we create, how we believe, and to approach this very important issue that all of us are concerned with. We should have, I call this a system biology approach, but maybe it should be considered as simply a biological approach to the human brain, and try to understand exactly where we are making theories and for what. And this is just to illustrate that we have to think about the human brain from the atoms, the molecules, which themselves make cells, which create networks, and which create ensemble of networks of cells, to reach a level where we may have a social life, conscious processing, and have language to communicate between each other. So this is nothing very original. This idea has been present since, if I may say, Darwin and others. But I think we have to be very practical and take into consideration all these variables and try to see to what extent what we are knowing at this level can be useful for a higher level. And conversely, so this is, if I may say, a bottom-up approach, but also, as was said yesterday by Norbert, to have the complementary view that what's happening at the higher level may have some regulatory function on the bottom, and in particular the cognitive function, not only on the gene level, but on the property of these proteins, which I just simply illustrate here. So this view is in fact a little bit simplified, and of course we have to take into consideration not only the reciprocal hierarchy between levels, but also the fact that there are a lot of parallel processes taking place, and there is diversification and integration taking place all along these different pathways. So we may see the human brain as a self-organizing physico-chemical system, and what is very important that we proposed initially that there was some kind of Darwinian transition between the levels by variation selection, and that's where the stochasticity we heard yesterday may take place. Darwin already talked about the variation, the variability, and if we want to have a Darwinian evolution at all these different levels, from the gene to the proteins to the higher network, then we need some variability with stochasticity and selection. So at the end, we reach a level where the system operates in a projective style, and this is a big difference with the viewpoint of many computational scientists who always view the brain as an input-output kind of system. In fact, we are not working on an input-output system. We are, in fact, constantly asking questions to the environment. And when I give my talk, I see your eyes asking what this changer is going to tell us, and how are we going to believe what he says. This is present even if I say something. So it means that you are constantly projecting your internal representation on the outside world, and this is more than a philosophical point of view. I think it's a very important aspect of the theory we want to build if we want to have this view adequate to reality. So I will examine 3 levels, and which are more easily studied, the molecular, the neuronal, and the cognitive level, and try to discuss with you successively these three levels in a bottom-up manner. And I will start with the most elementary organized level in living species, which is the molecular level, proteins. You could start from genes, but I selected that. And then go up to the consequences of these studies on the molecular level, up to the neuronal network and the cognitive level. So the origin of the data I will show to start, in fact, originated from my training when I was a student as a marine biologist. And I studied the relationship between parasite and host. And then I realized that I would never be able to understand really what's happening there if I don't introduce chemistry. And having thought about that, I went to Jacques Monod laboratory, and he said to me, "What do you want to work on?" I said, "On the chemistry of development." And he said to me, "You are not going to be able to do that. We were in 1959. Nobody in France is working on that. But if you wish, you can come to my lab, work with me, and then select some of the problems." There were several problems raised at that time. The regulation of gene expression, this was at the origin of the operon. But there was also Navik and Szilard, and Umberger and Gerhardt and Pardy, who have been discovering an interesting phenomenon, bacteria, where you can see in the sequence of chemical reactions, biochemical pathway. Then it has been discovered that with some bacterial species and some reaction, the end product of the pathway is able to feedback, inhibit the entry of the pathway. So this is, if you wish, some kind of economical process which saves a waste of energy if the compound, isoleucine, is provided by the environment, then it's biosynthesis stops. And immediately I jumped on that problem and wanted to try to understand how this regulation that happened. Of course, I'm sorry for those who don't like protein and channels at the protein level. And my reasoning was that there was a catalytic activity, which was measured here, and there was in addition a regulation. So these were two processes. And if there were two processes, one should be able to uncouple these two processes. And that's the first thing I tried to do as a PhD student with Jacques Monod. And I found that one was able, in fact, to keep the enzyme active and eliminate the feedback elimination, the feedback regulation. So we have an enzyme which is active but not regulated. And therefore there was some spatial architecture of the protein which was involved in the feedback inhibition. And a similar finding was done by Gerhardt and Pardy. And Jacques Monod, we were in 1961, found that this was an interesting finding. As a boss, he did not want to be associated with my work. He said, this is very unusual now, because all the boss always pick the PhD student work. And in the opposite, he told me, this is your finding, you publish it by yourself. Maybe he did not believe in it too much, so that I don't know the interpretation. And he asked me to present this data at the Cold Spring Harbor Symposium 61. And I suggested two models to account for the phenomenon I just discovered. Either to have overlapping sites, and one could, for instance, have some way to selectively alter this kind of steric interaction between the site for isolation and for serotonin, or to have two separate sites which would interact with each other. It would be an indirect interaction. And at the end of the meeting, Jacques Monod gave a summary of the different presentations, particularly my presentation, and proposed the word allosteric, which means that there are two types of sites with different stereo-specific properties, but which interact through conformation change linking the two sides. So from the beginning, there was an attempt to relate structure and function. For me, that was an essential aspect of all the work I did, and I'm still doing that. And never try to work on structure independently of function and function independently of structure. So this led, at the end of my thesis work, I make a long story short, to a model, and I wanted to have a model at the end of my thesis. I was a beginner, if I may say, and then Jacques Monod was helped for me to try to elaborate this kind of general model. And Jeffrey Wyman was a very distinguished physical chemist also, to part of it, to less extent. And from all my work, experimental work on the thesis, an interesting thing happened, that there were not only effectors which are substrates, like threonine, but also other ligands which were acting either as the inhibitor, isoleucine, or as activator, like valine. And they interact with each other through cooperative interaction. So the key issue was to try to find a way to express this integration at the molecular level between topographically distinct sites and cooperativity linking all these different set of sites. The idea came out, which was from some experiments I did on the splitting of the receptor of the protein to subunit, that possibly not only the protein should be an oligomer made up of identical subunits, so they could cooperate, some microcrystal, if you wish. And then the idea was also that there might be different states, at least two states, and that one would switch from one state to the other and conversely. And for Jacques Monod, this was linked to the symmetry. He had some kind of Platonist belief in symmetry. And for me, it was more simply the fact that we have some kind of microcrystalline structure and linking the cooperative units together. And we made a postulate which has been very criticized, but happened to be true after 30 years, that, and this was strictly from the examination of lysasis data, that these two states would pre-exist to the binding of ligand. So the signal transduction would be, in fact, to have at the beginning these two states in reversible equilibrium, and then the ligand would stabilize one state for which there is preferential activity, or the other state. And that would be the signal transduction mechanism. And now, this was, of course, written as a mathematical model, and the very important aspect of it is that we have here an isomerization constant between pre-existing conformation, and that these two pre-existing conformations may again exist in the absence of ligand, which would only shift the equilibrium in one direction or the other. And this led to the distinction of a binding function and to a state function. The state function mapping the conformation, the binding function, mapping the occupation of the site. And of course, this was contrary to Cauchelon and his clique, which was very large at that time, that the ligand would not induce the conformation change, but in fact select in a Darwinian manner some pre-existing state. And this is, I think, also a very important philosophical view, which is in agreement with the scheme I showed at the beginning, that if we have some kind of level of organization with Darwinian mechanism, of course, the Darwinian mechanism act on pre-existing variations, and these are at least two. Now, this, yes?
That doesn't, Cauchelon is it?
No, sorry.
It's not me.
Sorry for that.
Isn't Cauchelon the guy with the induced fit?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Cauchelon is induced fit, right? Isn't induced fit also a conformational change?
Yes?
Because you just
But
said
it is a conformational change which is common to many physicists as well. They like it because they find it's the easiest way to change the organization of the system is to induce a change by the ligand. But that's not the way it is. In fact, the organism evolve intrinsically and produce the change by themselves, as Darwin said, and then they are selected from the outside. So this postulates a conformational change, I repeat myself, which is here between states which pre-exist to the ligand, and the ligand stabilize any one of these two states. Is it clear? You don't like it, huh?
No, I like it.
You are free to.
No,
you are not, I can tell you, you are not the only one who did not like it for years. So
this kind of very
after 30 or 40 years, it seems to be accepted now.
No.
So this is in fact something which was initially done when I went into the lab of Howard Chapman, John Gerhardt, with phosphate transcarbamylase. And here we were able to follow the conformational state and here the binding state. And as you can see, it's a real prediction that there is not a fit between the binding and the conformation, since they are different. It means that you have conformation which are those of the active conformation in the absence of the ligand. So this has been further demonstrated by X-ray crystallography. And you have here the example of aspartate transcarbamylase by Lipscomb and colleagues. And another demonstration, which is rather beautiful, with lactic dehydrogenase by Iwata and colleagues, where the two states are present in the same crystals. And in addition, as you can see here, the conformation change is essentially a quaternary change, in the sense that you have the subunits which change position with each other. And the most interesting thing is that, this is important for the nicotinic receptor, that the ligand binding sites are at the boundary between the subunits here. Here you have the regulatory site, and here you have the catalytic site. And you can see the intrinsic tertiary conformation doesn't change from here to there, change little. And Max Perutz at the time, who were working on hemoglobin, said, there is no tertiary change. I said, no. We say there is essentially a quaternary change, we agree, but there is also a tertiary change, but which is minor compared to the quaternary change. So this is the view you can have on the right about the kind of rotation that you can propose for the organization of the subunits. Now, at the end of my thesis work, still being concerned by higher organisms other than bacteria, I propose that this allosteric mechanism might be true for communications in not only within the cells, as in bacteria, but between cells, and in particular between nerve cells. So this is indeed the case of the synapse. You heard a lot about it, and the action of the neurotransmitter on the post-synaptic membrane. And there I propose two possibilities. One, that we have oligomers with axis of symmetry perpendicular to the membrane, which possess transmembrane polarity through the membrane, and the top is different from the bottom and overstay. And that's a very important aspect compared to the enzyme I just illustrated before. And also that you may have, in some cases, receptors, proteins in the membrane. I know that here some people don't like the protein in membranes, I'm sorry for that, but I spend my life on that. But here the idea being that the protein could interact with each other, make a lattice structure, have phase transition, beautiful phase transition, as those which were demonstrated here, and therefore have a dramatic change. Unfortunately, as I discussed yesterday night, this kind of structure hardly exists in a eukaryotic cell. Maybe they do exist, they have to be found in some places that we ignore still, but they have been recognized very clearly in the case of bacteria, and you have here some kind of actual lattice that you can find in bacteria for chemotaxis, and I may say that Cochran himself has been much concerned by this kind of studies. I have nothing against Cochran, but against these ideas, it's very different. And so this is a situation where indeed phase transition has been found by Dennis Bray at the cellular level and behave in a really with some kind of hysteresis and so on and so forth. So unfortunately they do not exist in the case of the synapse, and the proposal I made was to identify the nicotinic receptor in the brain or in excitable tissue, and at that time there was no receptor known to exist. There was only the work of the concept of receptor by Langley in 1905. It was a very clever British scientist who have not been recognized compared to Sir Henry Day and others, but who, to my opinion, has done a much more important conceptual work by proposing that there are indeed receptors in membrane which are specific. At the time he was working with the neuromuscular junction for nicotine and curare. And so we decided to identify the receptor, went with David Nathanson to work with him. And that was a very important time. There was Tom Podesky, Arthur Kahn, Israel Silman were in the lab at the time. And the thing I did was to work with the elementary cell of the electrical plaque, which is the one I showed in my first slide, which is the basic unit of the electric fish, electric organ, which is, by the way, the richest tissue in nicotinic synapses and nicotinic receptors. There are grams of receptor protein per kilogram of electric organ. But to do that, and again, this explains some of the questions I raised here, we need to have a specific ligand able to catch absolutely. Several attempts were made by Karl, by myself, by Karl, by Israel, some successful, but they were not enough specific, to my opinion, to identify the protein. And in fact, the key came from the snake venom toxin, the bisphenol B, which, as you can see here, block the binding of decalcium. The protein can be purified, separated from the esterase, seen by electron microscopy. And you can see, for those who like the lipid membrane, that the postsynaptic membrane is almost a crystal of two-dimensional crystal of receptor protein, but these receptors don't interact with each other, which is extremely interesting. They are, in fact, proteins underlying the receptor which separate the subunits. So the sequence was established, and then the work of Numa and Reimann, ourselves, led to the proposal of the complete amino acid structure with a domain extracellular binding the orthosteric ligand, acetylcholine, then a transmembrane domain through which the ion goes through, and then a cytoplasmic domain. And this is a view of Nigel Unwin by electron microscopy of the receptor. And I show that because I think it's extremely interesting for us to see that the two sites for acetylcholine are 40 angstrom far between each other, and that the distance between the site and the ion channel, the transmembrane domain, are 60 angstrom. Therefore, there must be some allosteric interaction, and there must be some kind of conformation change to link these different sites together during synaptic transmission. And the problem was that despite the wide diversity of subunits, I show that briefly, but I will, if I have time, use some of them for higher main function. The issue was to really progress in the atomic structure of the receptor, and by chance it was shown by Tasnim and collaborators that there are sequences in bacteria which are very similar to those of the brain nicotinic receptor family. Simplified, no domain, synaptic, no cytoplasmic domain, no alpha, but very simple-minded. And when I read this paper, I said, we have the solution here. And indeed, this receptor, this protein, was purified, introduced in lipid bilayers. Thank you for the work done on bilayers. Introduced also into cells, channels recorded. And the interesting thing is that the pH, you see happening the pH there, was found to be the best agonist for this receptor, and you can see how it can open very easily. Now there are some other lines which have been identified then, but this is interesting to note that shifting from pH 7 to pH 5 open the ion channels. So this led to the extra structure of first Erwinia and then Gloriobacter, and you can see that you can identify within the transmembrane domain the alpha helix, and we had initially shown that the M2 helix through labeling was on the wall of the ion channel, and here they are. So there is already a remarkable analogy for the transmembrane domain between torpedo fish, and this was from Baldwin, and Erwinia, and from our own work with Gloriobacter, it was a much higher resolution at 2.9 Angstrom, and where you can see here something which is very important for us, not only have the amino acid lining the ion channel, and show that we can fill them with detergents here, and have also, and this is very interesting for us, some lipids, which are even going in between some of the alpha helices, linking, making up the transmembrane domain. So we have a very nice structure which has been since then extensively studied. This is 2009, 10 years ago, and there have been a lot of work at higher resolution to explore how the ions go through, a lot of molecular dynamic simulation. And we are at a stage now where there are at least 6, if 7 receptors which are extra structure is known. And as you can see, the structure is extremely similar between the glic and now the nicotinic receptor from the human brain. And therefore we have to say that this is a really non-intelligent design, if I may say, because the design of our brain proteins was made by bacteria, and that in fact they are the origin, these receptors from bacteria are the origin of our receptor from the brain, and therefore, perhaps you may not accept that, of our higher brain function. Let's say what is called in some books, the mind, the spirit, whatever it is. So this is something of real interest for us, and of course there are a lot of implications for that. And one is what we call allosteric modulation, and that's where the general anesthetics are going to come, if I may say, because you have a lot of talks about general anesthetics. I will give you a very different opinion from the one you heard about. The idea being that, in fact, in these receptor molecules, there are sites for neurotransmitters, there are sites for the ion, so the channel, which can be identified by covalent labeling, by antagonists, by mutation. but there are also other sites which are modulatory sites and through which you may regulate the efficacy of the signal transduction and have there, remember the MWC scheme, the two states, and shift one state on the other. So this is, I think, an important issue. One of the first one identified by us was the calcium modulatory site for the alpha-7 receptor. You can see here that it has a dramatic effect on the frequency of channel openings. And the site can be identified by site-direct admutagenesis, and that's where we think the site is located, here below the acetylcholine binding site. So this is a site which is still of unknown pharmacology, but of great interest for us, because it means that calcium ions, in fact, are absolutely necessary for the alpha-7 receptor to operate in our brain. So the physiological role of allosteric modulation is unambiguous. Now, what about ivermectin? This was done with Daniel Bertrand from Geneva, and he was working with this compound, which is a vermifuge, because it was found in Switzerland, in France as well, that when one treats cows with ivermectin, then the pollution of the field is enormous. You have shit everywhere. And why? Because normally the insect eats it, like it, eat it, and it disappears from the field. And with ivermectin, the insects are killed. Because it's not only an agent acting on worms, it's the reason why it was given to cows, but also to insects. And we decided, so why not to try it on the brain alpha-7 nicotinic receptor. And the effect was absolutely dramatic. You can see here the effect of ivermectin on the activity of the alpha-7 receptor. And also the discovery was made that mutation in the transmembrane domain simply abolish the effect. So that there was an effect of this natural compound on the response of the receptor, and which involved the site in the transmembrane domain. And of course, we thought that there might be other compounds acting like that. And we found, and this was essentially Pierre-Jean Thoringer who did the work, and that in fact the bacterial receptor is modulated by not only ivermectin, but also by general anesthetics like discuran and propofol. And the mutation in the transmembrane domain also alter their effects. So the proposal was that the general anesthetics behave are allosteric modulators of the ligand-gated ion channel. Not only the alpha-7 nicotinic receptor, not only the bacterial receptor, but the GABA receptor, which is, of course, thought for many years to be the site of general anesthetics, and there are good evidence for that through mutagenesis, and in fact, transgenic mice were the site for general anesthetic have been modified. So this is the data for the general anesthetic binding site. And what is interesting here is that it is in the transmembrane domain, and it is at the site where lipids are binding. Same site has been found for ivermectin. This was for lesfuran, like Guo, and for alcohol, Magdalene. So there is clearly a strategic site present on the nicotinic receptor, which is involved in the effect of general anesthetics. And the most interesting thing for here, I'll just introduce this slide today, is that there is an effect, of course, of lipids as allosteric modulators. And you can see in this work of Messinger that where lipids do interact with the nicotinic receptor and how they can change the properties of the nicotinic receptor by changing the equilibrium between the two states. So this is not antagonist to the idea that there might be an access through the lipid phase to these sites, but our view is that these are the critical sites for the physiology of general anesthesia. And now, having done all that, of course, we have been concerned by the mechanism of the allosteric transition. And fortunately, Marc Delarue was able to get the closed and open conformation of GLIC and the express structure. And making a long story short, there are two kinds of motion which are extremely interesting to analyze at the atomic level because they go from one end of the receptor to the other end and conversely. So there is a twist and a bloom which is taking place during the conformation change, which can be simulated by molecular dynamics. As you can see, this was done by Imen and Marco Secchini in Strasbourg, student of Martin Karpus. And here we show that during this allosteric transition, the site for the neurotransmitter, this is a glutamate receptor, is changing during the transition. And also the allosteric site, and in particular the site for ivermectin, and therefore also for general anesthetics. So we have clearly now an analysis at the atomic level of the effect of general anesthetics on the nicotinic receptor. And now there are quite a number of medicines which are being developed. Now I am very late, so I will move quickly to... yes, but I think I am going to go much faster than expected. I'm leaving that. And go to the cognitive level.
At this point, can you just repeat the moment you had the esterase, you had the pH change?
Yes.
At the end, the pH change comes again. What was before the pulmonatoxin came into the game? And Nachmanson had made proposals about esterase inseparable and so on with difficulties. What was going in yourself having had the acetylcholine esterase, which has all these specificities? You didn't have the lipids, but you couldn't say what the protons will be doing, and still they are doing. What was going on in yourself of leaving the acetylcholine
The esterase?
which you had in your hand? What was really going on in yourself?
But this was done essentially either in silico or in vitro. And most of it without on receptors which are not the nicotinic receptor, which are the glycine or glutamate receptor, which are easier, or the bacterial receptor.
The esterase in your hand, you have pH in your hand.
Yes.
You have everything in your hand and you
But I leave this to inside to work on it.
And
So,
you were all in Nachmanson's lab.
yes, so one is working on the esterase, and the other on the receptor. And I can tell you that in many synapses, there is not the equivalent of acetylcholinesterase. There are some degradative enzymes which are known, and it's extremely interesting that in the cholinergic system there is the esterase. It's rather unique as for acetylcholine. Maybe Israel can discuss that.
The synaptic lactic acid in your case?
But in my case,
In
they are
the
not.
esterase case. No, what was? No, we will be on the cognitive level.
But let me go to the cognitive level and see what the esterase is doing there.
Yes,
And then gas.
this is all a follow-up. But what made you decide to leave the esterase?
Why I decided to work on the receptor?
No, not to leave the esterase and to
Because I cannot work on too many things. I have a small brain, and I have to use my brain for one
follow
thing.
esterase, by the way.
So I work on I did not work on the esterase. Sorry for that. And since they were competent people working on it, so I don't see why I should work on it. Anyway, so just to introduce the issue of consciousness, which we think now is accessible to scientific approach, and the idea that you may have in your brain a physical space which is such that you may link different territories of your brain into a unique space. And when you are listening to me again, you have altogether, you look at me, you hear me, and you refer to your memories, and you make anticipations. All that in one space. So there must be a physical space somewhere. So the idea is that this space is in fact created by neurons which have long-range connection. That's what together with Stanislas Dehaene we propose, and Michel Kersberg, that these neurons were known from Cara molecular. They were known already from Dejerine to be present, and they have been confirmed by Kennedy work and by Patricia Goldman-Rakic. And our views is that we have some kind of workspace in our brain which is built up from this network, reciprocal network of long-range connection, which can be seen by brain imaging. So, just to go a little bit further, we were able to build up a computer model of this global neuronal workspace with long-range axon, and try to simulate its role in the cognitive task, which all of you know, which is the Stroop task. And in the Stroop task, people are asked to tell what is the color of the ink of the word blue, and everybody says blue. Well, it's not blue, it's yellow, and so on. So this is a well-known cognitive task where you make error and you have the possibility to, of course, find the right solution through a reward system. And interestingly, the effect of the reward is to change the synaptic efficacy, so it's a coincidence detector here through an allosteric mechanism. So you may have, in fact, with the allosteric receptor, a way to have a model of synaptic plasticity. This is the model, as we say. But anyway, when we simulate the task, you can show that the stimulated. This is the activation of the global neuronal workspace during the search, and when the solution is found, that it becomes silent. And these are the predictions for the brain imaging. And we find that the prefrontal cortex, which is crucial for having this long-range network, which develops especially in humans, is of course being activated. So this is something which has been further studied, and one can have a way to follow up using another task the conscious versus non-conscious processing, and found that there is a wave which is late, 200 milliseconds, associated with the prefrontal cortex. And when there is access to consciousness, you can see that there is some kind of particular wave. We called it with Stanislav's ignition. And this is something which also has been confirmed in the monkey. When you look at the primary visual area, then the secondary, then the prefrontal cortex, then there is an ignition, and the monkey start to see. So we are at a stage where we can distinguish the res cogitans from the res extensa. Cartesian was a pure materialist, even though people say that he was a dualist. And he distinguished two res cogitans and res extensa. They are here. And indeed, there is this very simple, there is a particular activity in the brain which is associated with physiology of the brain, which is being recorded. Again, these are just beginning things. And what I want to say here is that it is known that in the brain, this kind of ignition, as I illustrated, is taking place spontaneously. When possibly people are thinking about something nobody knows yet. But they are present. They are slow, kind of potential. And interestingly, there is ultra-slow fluctuation can be found in the mouse using calcium imaging. And last but not least, how can we modify this? By looking at the nicotinic receptor. So, we are linking the molecular with the cognitive level. And to finish up, just about the mechanism for general anesthesia. The mechanism we proposed was to imagine that this ignition, which is some kind of reverberation which is taking place here in the global neuronal workspace, involves bottom-up and top-down connection. And the idea was that general anesthetics act on the top-down from the prefrontal cortex, where there are targets. The general anesthetic as the one I mentioned at the level of the most likely GABAergic receptor. And there is very interesting work which has been done by Mashur, and this is recording. And what he found that during general anesthesia, there is a selective inhibition of the feedback connection that you can see here. So there is a selective effect of general anesthesia on some pathways in the brain. And so we think that there are some dedicated mechanisms which are the target of general anesthesia, and which exist there for simple regulatory function in the brain. And this is the end of my presentation. I had a few ideas about nicotinic receptor and schizophrenia then. So my conclusion is that we have to see the brain as a chemical machine, highly evolved chemical system, and that all our brain functions are rooted in chemistry. And of course, the relationship with the environment, which I did not discuss, which is extremely important. And the of course, important role for us of the allosteric proteins, because they are such regulatory proteins everywhere through the different levels of organization. And we have here, in fact, targets for new drugs. And as you know, this is an important issue nowadays. So this is Pierre Jean, currently work on and Marc Delarue on the receptor from nicotinic receptor and from the receptor from bacteria. Marco Secchini, we did the molecular dynamics. Stanislas and Claire on the global neural network space. And Marina Picciotto, who did the first knockout of the nicotinic receptor. And Fanny Kuguli and Yves Mascos, who work on this spontaneous fluctuation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I have first one statement, that is, I hope I speak for most of us. We believe in proteins, we accept that exist, and we don't hate them. It's the only thing that we believe that are things beyond that, especially on larger scales. And then my question to you is the anesthetics model that I presented yesterday provides two states for the membrane. One is solid and one is liquid. And then you have anesthetics binding to them, and they have different binding concept to the solid state and the liquid state. Isn't that exactly an anesthetic model like the one that you propose?
Maybe you could adapt it if you wish.
Because if you accept that, then you would immediately understand why it's
the thing we have, if I may find an important difference with what you mentioned, is that we are not so much looking at the state of the membrane itself, but at the state of the neurotransmitter receptor. And I think you have also to go from the state of the membrane to the physiology of the brain. And the idea is that when you have an allosteric site on the GABA receptor, you enhance inhibition. And when you enhance inhibition, then to the detriment of excitation, then you see.
But if you say instead of state of the membrane, conformation of the membrane, then it's just a one-to-one correlation.
No, but I am not certain that you have also to be careful, because the general anesthetics may have a lot of side effects, which are dangerous, actually. And what you want to have is a general anesthetics which has the, if I may say, the more specific effect on the state of wakefulness, on the global neuronal workspace. That's what we want. So we don't want to have a system which is acting everywhere in the body, everywhere in the brain, but somewhere which is the most limited we could find, which regulates the electrical activity of the brain, and in particular the activity of the pyramidal cell in the cortex. And what we want to do is to inhibit as much as we could the pyramidal cell and the way we find is to stimulate the GABA receptor, inhibit the acetylcholine receptor, and do a few things. I don't want to say it's a unique kind of mechanism, and I don't want to say that this is the mechanism which is actually operating, but I think it's a very simple and efficient kind of mechanism, and that can be tested. And not only, which is interesting, is that from the work I showed at the end, it's not only, it's acting only on some particular connection, according to Machaut. It's not acting everywhere in the cerebral cortex, but only on the bottom up, on the top down, I'm sorry. So it means that there is a highly specific effect, which we don't fully understand, I wish to be fair. But, so where are these GABA receptors located in the global workspace where this effect is taking place? We don't know. So I don't want to exclude any other kind of model as the one you suggest, but we have to realize that in this kind of pharmacological approach, we prefer to have an extremely localized, dedicated mechanism than to have a global one at the level of the whole membrane. But one does not exclude the other, and perhaps you have, to get the effect, you may have to go through the invasion of the membrane by the general anesthetics in general, because what you noticed is that this site is in the transmembrane domain and where a lipid is binding. So it means that you have to get a compound which goes there and have access to the site and control the allosteric transition. So I have no insight on what is happening between the general anesthetic you put in the blood and the way it goes to this site. I give you this responsibility.
I have a question concerning the concentration of this anesthetic pharmacology, because the standard statement I learned is when you need high concentration, that's not consistent with binding. On the other way around, to have specificity and to have binding includes that you have low concentrations to act as a pharmacology. Yes. So my question would be, what is the concentrations of these local anesthetics? Isn't that too high to have a...
No. The affinity is very high. On the site, the affinity is high, very high.
Yeah, but that would mean, this is why I asked. So the concentration you need in the concentrations you use in this experiment.
Yeah, the concentration we use, for instance, in the bacteria to have the general anesthetic effect is very low. It's like the physiological one, if I tell you, the pharmacological one.
Okay.
It's not at all in the 0.1 molar, not at all.
Okay.
Absolutely. It's orders of magnitude difference.
Yeah, it should be that at least in the micro, then it's better.
Oh, it's micro.
Right, just so. Okay.
I have a question regarding the anesthesia, and this is actually a question which goes to you. Namely, if you go in the clinic, there's a neurolab anesthesia, so where you basically affect the level of pain. And then you have the general anesthesia, what you basically put on this general anesthesia, where you have an effect on your consciousness plus your pain.
Yeah.
So if you really want to explain that, is that explained by receptors, or is that explained by our thermodynamic model?
No, it's the effect of, you have the global effect of anesthesia, which I think is different from the effect on pain. I don't think it's simply a loss of consciousness. That's what the general anesthetics call. This is their word. They use loss of consciousness. So when you are not conscious, you don't feel pain. But I'm not certain that this is something which is not exactly my field from medical point of view. And I still think that people who are under general anesthesia feel pain. I think they do. Now, the general anesthesia, the local anesthesia is very different. The local anesthesia...
No, it's not local, it's a general anesthesia. If you do that in neurosurgery, if you do a neurosurgery for a tumor, you basically do a neural lab anesthesia where the patient, you can talk to the patient, the patient responds, you can do the surgery. So that is primarily suppressing the pain of the patient and is not really pushing on the consciousness. And I agree with you that if you have anesthesia, the patient will feel pain, but it will basically process in a different way. And we know that from patients who basically woke up because they got succinylcholine and they got very light in their level and was not really recognized at that point, and then reports afterwards really went in that part. So for me the interesting question is there a difference in the target structure, in the chemical target structure, or is there leading to these two phenomena, because they are very distinct in the phenomena and they are treated in the medical field very distinctly.
No, I think, thank you very much for asking this question. This is a very relevant question. Very relevant. I am not a clinician myself, and I have to rely on people who are more competent than I am on this subject, and I can tell you that I don't have a real answer to your question. That's it. But it is an interesting issue to know whether the same mechanism is acting on state of consciousness and on pain perception. And maybe, maybe not, I don't know. Maybe because, well, the question is whether, I mentioned that already, when you are under general anesthesia, I still think that you perceive pain. I still believe now. I have been myself operated from surgery, and I can remember that recovering from the general anesthesia, I had the feeling to have enormously suffered. It was a subjective feeling, maybe it was wrong, but as if during the surgery there were a lot of nerves which were cut and so on and so forth. So this is something which I think it's a very interesting question.
I mean,
in the case of one way of solving it is local anesthesia, but local anesthesia is the typical local anesthetic is tetrodotoxin, TTX, and it's acting on the sodium channel and block the propagation of the nerve impulse. So that's a very well established case.
and that is another point where it's going in the same direction, because typically if you, and that's different in countries, so whether in France, Germany or the US, it's different how you treat pain treatment. So some start doing anesthesia where you don't have the percept of pain, you can start pain treatment which carries on in your state where you're conscious. So you have an extra treatment for pain and you have the extra treatment for anesthesia. So you have to, and in particular if you do animal experiments, and those who are on the committees should know that you typically start pain treatment before you even start anesthesia. Then you put the animal under to the surgery and you can recover, and then you have the pain treatment already sitting in place. If they start late, then you suffer pain, and that's for the human the same thing.
This suggests that the mechanisms are different, and I'm ready to accept that.
So, and then right now, if we're talking about what Thomas says, and you said, the question is, if you're talking about anesthetic, are you talking about the state where you're losing consciousness, or are you talking about the state where you're suppressing pain?
No, I'm talking about the loss. What I said, and I've been by Mashur and all these things, have been for the loss of consciousness. That's for sure. It's not on the issue of pain.
Well, I can say some.
Viewpoint, because I think that it's a very valid point. You have to be very careful if you look at, for a clinical viewpoint, what you define and what kind of drugs you're talking about. Because there's even a very big difference between the different general anesthetics, whether they have an effect on pain or not. So I think that if you want to work in this context, with the use of anesthetics, you should not call them anesthetics. their excitability.
Yes.
And if you go into calling them anesthetics, that creates a discussion about exactly what you raised. What kind of anesthesia are you really talking about?
No, but the question about pain is, as you said yourself, there is a treatment for pain which is being used in addition to the universal conscious, the general anesthesia. So there are separate treatments which are mixed together. But that I am not in a position to, I have not the experience of a general anesthetic, unfortunately, I'm sorry to tell that. But this is an interesting question.
All right, we will still have a round table tonight and we will have dinner tonight, so we will have time for more questions. Of course, there are still a lot of open questions, but we have to finish here for now and take a short break, and then we will continue with the second round table. But please give a hand